This is the Human Craft Podcast, and I'm your host, Beth Huddleston. Today's guest is Judy Liautaud. Judy is the author of 2 memoirs, one titled Sunlight on My Shadow, A Birth Mother's Journey from Secrecy to Renewal, and the second titled South of Ordinary, A Moving Tale of Young Love and Self-Discovery. She's also the author and publisher of several children's educational books through her publishing company, City Creek Press, including Times Tables the Fun Way, Addition the Fun Way, and Story Problems the Fun Way. In our interview, we discussed Judy's secret teen pregnancy, the pain and grief of giving up her baby for adoption, the healing and joy of finding and meeting her daughter decades later, and other ways in which she has healed and transformed throughout her life journey. Judy, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Beth.
Thanks for being here. You have 2 books. You have one called Sunlight on My Shadow and the other one, South of Ordinary. And both of these are memoirs. One, Sunlight on My Shadow, talking about when you became pregnant as a teenager and had to go away to a home for unwed mothers and give your baby up for adoption. And then South of Ordinary, your young adulthood with your husband, traveling, trying to navigate new marriage and dreams and all of that. So I want to let's start with, your depiction of what was going on in your life in Sunlight on My Shadow, your younger years. I think your story is a really interesting one, that you had this experience and just sort of all of the complexities of that. So let's start a little bit with when you first discovered that you were pregnant. You went through, let's say, quite an emotional experience. Let's talk about your reaction. What was your reaction and how did you sort of handle those first months of realizing that?
Well, in my mind, getting pregnant, going to an all-girls Catholic school was probably the worst thing I could have done. It was like I murdered it was such a horror that I didn't get my period. I kept checking. I go to the bathroom all the time when I was in school and hoping, that I'd find the good red news. And it was just very traumatic, horrible. It's probably the worst thing that I could have done, and in my mind, and probably a lot of other people's minds. And yeah, it was the hardest time of my life. And keeping that secret, not talking to anyone for 5 months, was super deadening to my spirit.
You talk about in the memoir that you really kind of almost froze up. We sometimes hear about this in the news where a teenager really doesn't tell anyone and keeps it total secret, and then the parents find out later and they're shocked and everybody's like, how does that happen? But I think that there is something going on emotionally, must be, that is almost like a frozen fear that is almost paralyzing.
Well, I couldn't, I thought, what should I do? Should I go to a doctor and talk to him? I had too much shame to tell anyone. And I just kept hoping that I was going to miscarry, because I've heard that, 1 in 5 miscarry or something like that. And so I just kept hoping. I just didn't know what to do. That was the worst part, keeping it secret. My boyfriend was the only one that knew about it. And then finally, I just got so big that I had to tell somebody. So I told my best friends. And then I told my sister. And then she said, well, we have to tell Mom and Dad. And I'm, oh, no. I thought maybe she could somehow help me without having to tell them. I didn't know what that would be. But after that happened, I was so relieved, because I knew there'd be an answer and something would happen. I've attended some birth conferences for women that, like me, that had their babies, secretly. And it's so severe that a couple stories I've heard, they don't tell anybody, and then they give birth in the bathroom or go somewhere without telling anyone. That's how big the shame is and the fear of it.
Yeah, that's what I can see it as. And thank goodness you did. Thank goodness you did tell your sister and she told your parents. Because at the bottom line of it, you were 16 years old. You're a 16-year-old kid. And, when that happens to a 16-year-old kid, this is a huge thing. And like you said, the deep shame about that, the idea of just like sitting down and telling your parents is not something that comes to mind, probably. It just doesn't come to mind right away.
I was just too scared. I just couldn't. I'd look at my dad at the dinner table and think, Oh, I should tell him, I just couldn't. I just couldn't.
And so when they did find out, I will say this is that you didn't always have warm treatment. You didn't have warm treatment when you went to the home for unwed mothers, but your parents did, at least from your memoir, sound like they were as kind as they could be about it, considering that they were disappointed and upset and all of that, but didn't necessarily try to lay on the shame a lot harder. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, I love that you have that perspective because people have said to me, oh, the way your dad treated you, that was horrible. And that hurts my heart because that's not what I wanted to convey. He was angry when he heard about it. And then once it was a done deal and we knew what we were going to do, he never, once he said to me, Judy, how could you have done that? When we were on the way to the doctors. But after that, we didn't talk about it. And he never laid on any more shame. So that was good. I commend them for that,
Yeah, and it's not like, I'm not saying, of course, it wasn't like it was perfect or something. And like you said, if you didn't talk about it at all, that is its own maybe level of discomfort or something. But at least considering they were very religious and that it was considered a very bad thing to do, that they didn't come down harder on you.
Yeah,
You had
and my
enough
mom,
shame.
said, it's all my fault. I wasn't there for you because she was in and out of the hospital a lot. She had rheumatoid arthritis. And I thought, oh, it's not your fault, Mom. It would have happened anyway, probably. I don't know. But there was no communication with my parents about dating or sex. It was just like it was something that I was not supposed to do, and I wasn't even supposed to date until I was 16. I used to sneak out and go in my boyfriend's car, and I would have gotten in huge trouble. And so it was just, that's the damage that's done with lack of communication. If I had been closer with my parents, but they weren't the type. But, I know my daughter's relationship with her kids is so different, where they talk about things that are personal, but there is so much shame and so much Catholic mandates that we never went there.
Yeah.
So that's why they were so surprised that I was pregnant.
Yeah, I think that is true. I think there's the not communicating at all. There also wasn't protection available for you, birth control or anything, and you're just a teenage kid. And I think there's a lot of layers to that.
Well, my boyfriend did have a rubber and it broke. And so, we did have that. We did have condoms, but unfortunately it broke. And I always thought he probably had it in his pocket for 2 years waiting for it to use it. I knew very well how you get pregnant and I was super scared of it, but yeah.
So then you basically did come up with I will say your dad came up with a plan, because your dad sounds like he was a guy who would come up with a plan anytime one is needed. Like if there's a problem, I think your dad was the guy, I might be frustrated from it, but I'll figure out a plan. So he did figure out a plan, get you to the doctor, confirm it, get you to this home for unwed mothers. So let's talk about that experience. There were plenty of other girls there with you at the time. I'm sure there's a lot of these homes I've heard of throughout the country. So that experience, let's talk about that a little bit. What was that like for you?
Well, let me back up just a second. When my dad got me to go to the doctor, initially he said, you're going to have an abortion, because he had no idea that I was that far along. You couldn't imagine I could be that far along. And so I was feeling my baby move inside my belly, and it scared me so bad. And so then, of course, when we went to the doctor said, no, she's too far along. So then we came up with a plan. So anyway, the home for unwed mothers was, well, first of all, I lived for 2 months with my parents' friends in Wapaka, Wisconsin. I didn't see anybody. I could go out. I had a car. I could go out shopping, but I didn't have any friends, didn't talk to anybody at all. And so when it came time to go to the home for unwed mothers, I was kind of excited because I would have people my age to talk to and things. So I don't know how many girls were there. Maybe there were 10 or 12. And we slept on cots it was kind of like barracks, like four in a room. And then we would go to the dining hall for dinner. And my job, everybody had a job. My job was to wash these giant pots. I had to do the dishes. And I remember barely being able to get over to, to reach the pots because my belly was so big. And they told us not to make friends because this was something slice in our life and we don't want to continue talking to people later. And I was called Judy L. Nobody knew that what my last name was. Everybody was Sarah M. And just so much shame around that. And then one time we went out to a bookstore and the owner said to us when we're looking at the cards on the rack, "We don't patronize your kind." And so I was so shocked, and it was an order to get out of the store, that we weren't welcome. That was probably the lowest point of the discrimination against us, and that was really hard.
Yeah, it was clear to me in reading your book that moment when you young girl, pregnant girls are in the store and the store owner says this to you and is just kind of really looking at you in a hateful way and actually saying, I'm so disgusted or whatever. I don't want you in this store.
Yeah.
Like for a young kid and you hadn't experienced anything like that in your life. And it seems like that just really stood out for you, which is understandable. It's like a sense of injustice that, like a stark difference from what you had experienced in your life to that moment.
Well, you know what it was is a little bit of lack of white privilege. It was the first time in my life that I was discriminated against because of how I looked. And so it was kind of an awakening or an enlightenment, like, wow, that happens to Black people all the time, and I had never been exposed to anything like that. So,
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, because then it's like it is so that sense of experiencing something that you can then understand and have more compassion for others, because if you think of that happening repeatedly throughout someone's life on a racial basis, and then how that wears someone's soul down, or that's what it struck me as is, and I think you even mentioned that it helped you have more compassion after that for people who might be subjected to that unfairly. So let's talk a little bit about growing up in an organized religion. In your case, it was Catholicism. And then as you got older, let's talk about kind of the moment where you started to distance yourself from that more. How did that come about?
Well, when I was pregnant, I prayed like a million rosaries. I just prayed and I said, "Please make me not pregnant. Please make." Now that's kind of crazy when you think of it, because nature had already taken over and I already was pregnant. So it wasn't really up to God to change that. I mean, but that's where my thinking was. But anyway, I felt kind of forsaken, or like that God disapproved of me, or I disappointed him. I knew I did, And then I think it was a couple years later when I started to think, well, maybe all the feeling so guilty about what I did was kind of a sham, and maybe I don't have to be that, keep beating myself up, keep shooting arrows at myself for what I'd done. Maybe that guilt that I learned from my Catholic upbringing was not useful to me anymore. And so I think I started to I lost my faith. It just gradually slipped away. So.
And so when that happened, did you feel like you felt an absence of something that had been such a big part of your life?
Not right at the moment. But then later in my life, I really felt an absence. I love that feeling of being close to God and being holy, and like when I would sit in Mass and being connected, and that He was taking care of me. And so when you don't have that anymore, what do you look to? What do you look to for that comfort? Like everything's going to be okay, that God would take care of you, that everything will be okay. That's a wonderful thing to have, that faith.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have it, You can't manufacture it. You can't pretend. I guess you can. They say fake it till you make it, but it hasn't really worked for me. I do feel spiritual, like I'm spiritual, but the God that I was raised with in the Catholic religion, sits in judgment and is disapproving of what I do and has in mind what I should do. I don't buy that anymore. So
Yeah, and I can understand and relate to the fact that when you said you can't manufacture it, it's not like, oh, I can just tell myself, go back to that belief. It's if it's lost, it's lost. But like you're saying, I think you've had experiences, and you talk about in South of Ordinary as well, your other memoir, that you have experiences that feel spiritual in their own way. And I'm going to jump back just a bit because when you were talking about, praying the rosaries to God and feeling forsaken, I jumped to kind of a big picture view where it's like, it feels like he's forsaken you, but God or some sort of universal energy or whatever in spirituality, whatever you want to believe, if you believe that there's like some sort of all loving, all knowing, whatever presence, it doesn't mean that you're forsaken. It could be an experience that maybe is a learning experience that benefits you, or a gift to someone else by putting this baby up for adoption. I'm just throwing things out there, but like if you look at it from a big picture view, you're saying, oh, this horrible thing's happening to me, but it's like also could be maybe meant to happen or good to happen. Does that make sense?
well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think at the end of my book, that's what okay, I did this horrible thing, but really, you know what? I gave the gift of life to this beautiful child, and how great is that? And so I thought, well, maybe her parents were supposed to have her to raise her up. But see, that's just relying back on my faith that I don't have, but I still think you can't just get rid of all of your teachings, they're still there.
Yeah.
And I still pray, and I don't know exactly who I'm praying to, but I believe, and if you believe something and you send out that energy, that prayers are answered. So
Yeah. So see there, it is interesting. None of these things have to have a label. And I think you and I both agree that it's like, there's nothing wrong with believing any of it, but just, it's what everybody can experience as true for themselves. And there's only
right.
what's true for them. And you can't create something that isn't there for you anymore, but you can experience whatever you do now.
Right. And if your belief is helpful to you and you get comfort from your beliefs, that's beautiful.
Exactly. So I do want to talk about that, though, when you mentioned bringing this beautiful baby into the world, and you did end up finding her after quite a long search later in life, and that she did have wonderful parents. Let's talk about when you did find her and you first learned of her being there and then met her. What were all the sort of mixed emotions that you experienced upon meeting her?
It was so confusing, Beth. I had this intense love and a desire to meet her for, ever since she was born. I thought I had fantasies of going to the playground in Milwaukee where she lived and seeing if I could find little kids that looked like my daughter. And I really wanted to meet her because I had wished that I had held her when she was born, but I didn't. But finally, I got her information through this searcher who went through all the birth certificates in the county and matched up the one that was born at 1:10 p.m. on my daughter's birth date. And so we knew that was her. Because back then, when you gave a baby up for adoption, you did not know who the parents were, and they changed the name. And on this birth certificate, the parents are the only parents. I'm not named or anything. So I sent her a letter, and she agreed to meet with me. And when I saw her, I just wanted to hug her and kiss her and say, oh, my long-lost baby, I'm so glad I found you. It was like such a miracle. But she didn't have any of those feelings because she didn't have that loss. She didn't experience that loss because she had great parents. And so I couldn't just gush all over her, but it was really healing to meet her and know that she had a good life, because I'd heard of other children that were adopted who went to parents that were alcoholics or abused them or whatever. So I was really lucky that way.
Yeah, that is really, and she sounds like she's just like a wonderful person as well.
Yeah,
So
she's really
that's a
cool. She's a
joy.
nurse, and there's a lot of medical people in my family. And she came to my wedding when I got remarried 18 years ago, and everybody was, "Whoa, you're Karen," fawning over her because she was my daughter, and it was kind of fun.
Yeah, yeah. So that was a really happy ending, as happy as that could be, really, in those circumstances. Because
Yeah.
I can imagine a lot of people in your position don't ever get to meet. They don't have never had the chance to meet that baby. And if they've had those longings, and I don't see how there wouldn't be grief about having to let that baby go.
Yeah.
And let's jump to that because, at that time when you're 16 and this is the plan that you're following, that your dad has laid down, and you talk about in your book, like that, looking at her through that glass after she was born and wanting to hold her, but being afraid to hold her because you were afraid you wouldn't be able to let her go. And all of those emotions. And some of the girls did hold their babies. I mean, that's intense. That's intense stuff to then have to let the baby go. So I really feel like there's got to be such a grief, and a lot of women who've gone through that have got to feel that.
Yeah.
That just carries through their life, I would imagine. Because for you, it sounds like it did, and maybe could lay dormant at times, but then would come up.
Yeah, well, your first baby, you just don't really have any clue of how, when that baby's born, how you're going to fall in love with it. It's just so intense. And that surprised me. I didn't expect that. I thought I could just put it in my past and go back to school and everything's fine. But she was so beautiful. I wanted her so bad. It's
Yeah.
so unnatural to say, "Here, take my baby."
Mm-hmm. So what do you think were the most healing things that happened to you in your adult life to deal with that grief, or, any other sort of, your mom, like you mentioned, she was very ill for a lot of your childhood. She was in and out of the hospital. She was in a wheelchair because she had such bad arthritis. And in that sense, too, there was probably some pain there. And then, with the secret around your pregnancy and the grief of losing your baby and all of that, like as an adult, finding little places to find healing, what are some of the ones that stand out to you?
Well, meeting Karen was a big one. And probably, well, therapy. I was in a class, and one exercise, there were like four of us. It was a group therapy thing. I forget what the name of it was. I can't believe I'm remembering this. But so what she had us do, I was saying that I felt so bad how I'd let my father down and the shame and stuff. And so what we did in the exercise was, she put a chair there and she said, "Imagine that's your father sitting in the chair." And then I talked to him. And I did, and I told him, I was so sorry. And what I got back from my dad was that it was okay, that he forgave me and that he understood. And it wasn't in real life. It was all imaginary, but I felt like I really connected with my dad during that session. And that was a huge healing because I hated to disappoint my dad. I just, he was the kind of guy that you always wanted to do the right thing. And I felt like he understood. Although while he was alive and my mom was alive, we never talked about it once after I came back from the home for unwed mothers. And then they both died. I felt like I could write the book because I think they wouldn't have approved of me bringing all this up that they've kept so carefully secretized.
Yeah,
So,
but when you're telling me that, having this experience as if your father's sitting there in the chair, and I can imagine that seems like it could have been real, because I can imagine your dad would, if he were sitting there now, would be like, "I forgive you. You were a teenager. You did this thing. It's okay." Doesn't that seem real to you? Like, if you can imagine yourself in your dad's perspective, looking at his little daughter who did this, don't you think that makes
Yeah, it
sense.
seems very real because, well, my dad had the stern facade that you always do the right thing. But deep down, he'd been through a lot of trauma himself, and I think he would understand. He understood, and
Yeah.
it felt real. Yeah, it definitely felt
Yeah.
real.
I can see that. I can definitely see that. And just if it was your own child and all of that, like that. And that's the other thing is when you did go to the home for unwed mothers, it was wow. Like, I mean, it was a punishing experience from my reading of it in your memoir,
Mm.
that coldness that was displayed. And I understand that, you know, from the nun's perspective that you had done something very sinful, but whoo, you're thinking of like these little 16-year-old kids sleeping on cots. You have no clue what it's going to be like, the labor. You have no one talking to you or comforting you. And when you describe your labor scene that went on and on and on for hours and hours and hours, and you're all by yourself in there, I mean, really almost entirely by yourself in a room, that was tough. That
Oh,
sounds like that was
yeah.
very
I was
tough.
very frightened. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I can just really imagine because when you said that part about that you think, oh, there's got to be something wrong because this pain is so horrible that it feels like something very terrible is happening and maybe this is not normal. I can imagine that's how it must feel. And then you're a scared little kid and no one's in there to help you. So yeah, that was sad. What are your thoughts now when you look back on it?
Well, I mean, people have said to me, your mom should have been there with you, or your sister, or somebody should have been there with you. Maybe, but why go there? Why say they failed me? I mean, it just was what is, but it didn't have to be that traumatic if there was a doula or somebody. But I think what happened with that experience was that when I had my own babies, I had them at home. And because I had two children after I gave away Karen, and I just had this real yearning to make birth better for women because I saw how horrible it could be and how beautiful it could be with the home birth. And that was healing, probably having my own babies too. And so I did become a lay midwife for 7 years. And I think that experience kind of was a key to me being interested in helping other people, women, have better experiences.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. So let's jump to when you got a little older. You were a young adult and you met who became your first husband, Dave. And in South of Ordinary, your second memoir, you talk about he had these dreams to travel the world, and they were really kind of both of your dreams is what you thought at the time, but you fleshed that out throughout the memoir and coming to terms with what you really wanted or what he really wanted. But I do think that's a common thing. I do think that's a common thing, being young and maybe coming out of trauma or whatever, and then not being able to decipher one's own inner voice from outside influences. And I think that's just a common experience. So I do want to talk about that a little bit. When you did travel around the world with him, I don't think you were really enjoying it. I don't think you really wanted to do it. But you, at that time, consciously, is it correct that you consciously thought you did?
Yeah. Yeah. I thought I was choosing this.
Right, right.
And
You
in
see,
a
so
sense, I was choosing it, but I had a lot of resistance. Like, oh, I wish I was at our cabin in Colorado fixing it up. I love that homey feeling of being in one place and being able to, that's my favorite thing in the world is to fix up the place I live in. And so I would have a lot of fantasies and dreams while we were traveling of, oh, how great it's going to be when we get back. And it was hard to be right, enjoying the moments.
but talk about why you think that you did take that on as your own dream and consciously thought it was what you wanted at the time.
Well, Dave was the perfect guy. I mean, he had no regrets. He had no shame. He always thought he was right. He thought, you got to live life and take risks, and why sit on the couch and be a couch potato? Get out and see the world. And I love that. That was just so attractive to me, especially after I tried so hard to fit in and be part of society and do the right thing, and I failed miserably. just 3 years earlier when I met Dave. And so he was kind of like the key or the answer to what I needed.
Yeah.
So he said, when I met him, he said, I'm going on this trip. I'm planning to go around the world on this travel trip. And so, we'll see what happens with our relationship, because that's what I'm doing. And so after a while, I thought, oh, maybe he'll take me along with him. And so
Yeah.
I kind of weaseled my way into that. So,
Yeah, it's interesting though. I think I am kind of fascinated with that whole thing, because then I think in your fantasies that you're having of like being back home and making it nice and all this kind of stuff, I think that's like probably your inner voice is like, hey, you probably want to be doing this instead of what you're doing right now. Like
right.
it's popping up, speaking up, I mean, I'm fascinated with that, because I think we are faced with so many pressures around us as humans. So, so many influences and pressures and the people around us and what they think. And it can be hard. It can be hard. And it sounds to me like in your memoirs that for you, it felt like a many-year experience to tune in to your own wants and needs and things like that. Because it is hard in our society, I
Well,
think.
it was so foreign to me. I was always wanted to please others, and I didn't like when I start thinking, oh, I really don't want to travel. I think I want to just stay here. I just think, oh, that's dumb. You're just being a wimp. You should love adventure. You're going to grow so much from this, and you'll see other countries. And so you have these little thoughts of what your true desires are, but you don't allow them because it doesn't go along with what you've already decided you wanted to do.
Yeah. But yeah,
So,
it does sound like you feel that you reached a point where you were able to get in touch, though. That
yeah.
you've gotten to that place where you can get in touch with that inner
Yeah,
voice
with my
more.
life with Dave, and then that was when things kind of fell apart in our relationship.
When you think at the point where you kind of got in
When
touch
I
with,
started to just not say whatever you want, I had to kind of stick up for myself
yeah,
and
yeah, and maybe
say no.
maybe that just doesn't work. Sounds like
Yeah,
it just didn't work in that
yeah,
relationship. But yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'm going to jump to something else, because I find, you are a midwife. You and Dave had a hang gliding business. Like you have had quite many experiences. And then you got into writing educational kids books. Tell me about that. These books that are designed just to be easy for kids to learn.
Well, Dave, my ex-husband, and I were running a Sylvan Learning Center, which is a place where kids come for extra help that need help in school. And so the kids came to us and we couldn't teach them anything because they didn't know their times tables. How could you teach them how to do these math problems when they don't have the basics? So we decided to come up with little stories so the first story we came up with was 8 times 8, and they were little snowmen, and they want to go camping, and they come to this fire, and there's a sign that says the sticks are for the fire. And so sticks are 4 sounds like 64. So when they see the eights, they think snowman, they go camping, sticks are 4, 64. So it's kind of like a mnemonic visual way to learn the times tables. And it ended up being wildly successful. I'm still selling the books. It's been 35 years. It's called Times Tables the Fun Way. And then there's Addition the Fun Way and Story Problems the Fun Way and several support materials that go with that. And so I've been running that business for quite a while and sell mostly to teachers and parents, and kids with learning differences really do well with it, like
Wow,
dyslexia and ADHD. And
that's pretty cool.
yeah, it's citycreek.com if you want to look it up.
City Creek Press, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk about the sort of dichotomy between how that just huge secret of your pregnancy that you and your family kept, and to the point where you and your parents didn't talk about it, as you mentioned, not even one time after you came back from having the baby. So there's this huge whopping secret and this huge shame that you carried with you about this experience. And then you get to the point in your life where you write a memoir about the experience. This is such a, going from one extreme to the other. And this is what I see with a lot of people when they have any kind of big experience that is a secret or shameful. And then they go along in their development and in their healing process. And then they write about it in a way that is healing for them, but also can connect with other people who might need or want to hear some story like that. So what was that experience like for you writing the memoir? What was the writing process like, and how did that affect you?
I just had this yearning to write my story, and I didn't know why or where that came from. I just wanted to write my stories. So I started writing, and then the next day I would read what I wrote, and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't ever let anyone read this. It's way too embarrassing. And then I'd put it away and I'd quit. And then a few days later I go, I prompted again to write. And so I realized as I was writing, tears would come, and I started to understand that young child who was me, that teenager, and forgive her for what she'd done, because I understood. No wonder that happened, given you were kind of set up for that whole thing. Not that I didn't take responsibility, but I found forgiveness. And so it was an amazingly healing experience for me, and it actually changed my life because I got rid of the shame. I can talk to anyone about it now. I used to, when I bring it up or try to talk about it, my voice would shake and I couldn't really find the words. I'd say, oh, that happened to me, this teenage pregnancy, and then people would just drop it because they'd be embarrassed to ask me questions. I didn't know how to start talking about it, but writing the book was major. And I just want to encourage anyone who has a story to write it just for your own self. I mean, I didn't know that I was going to publish it. I just wrote it, and then when it was done, I got excited about letting other people read it. So
did you come across like reactions where people really got something out of it, connected with it?
Oh, yeah. I've had emails from women who said, that's my story, but I've never told anyone. And it just breaks my heart that still, I'm in my 70s and that happened to me, but I never told anyone. Or I've gotten emails that say, you put into words exactly my experience. And so I love that. That's so great. I mean, what can be better than that? That's worth all the writing right there to hear that,
Yeah, I bet. That's what I was imagining. So I think that covers everything that I wanted to ask you about, but please tell me if there's anything else that you want to make sure we talk about.
Well, your questions are really deep and make me think. Thank you. It was really fun to do, and I can't think of anything else, but thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here and talking about all this stuff. I really, really appreciate it.